So, when it comes to Donald Trump, I find that it's actually hard to keep up. Literally hard to keep up with the number of Trumpisms that should really disqualify this man from the White House. Um, I remember when George W. Bush was in the White House, there was a Bushisms was a thing because he came out with a lot of gaffes in his speeches. But George W. Bush really does come across as a statesman by comparison. And Bush had some serious foreign policy mistakes, blunders, indeed moral shortcomings, um, which shouldn't be overlooked, but it just puts things in context. I mean, it's said that when people go into a debate with Trump, whether it be Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, it's almost like they're overwhelmed with lies. So it's almost an overwhelming sense of what do you tackle first here? And it's so ironic that he runs a website called Truth Social when he is one of the biggest liars around. I just find it hard to keep track. I mean, I can make videos on any one of these issues, but for the purpose of space and not being too repetitive, I'll I'll make it into one video. So NATO, not the first time Trump's attacked NATO, but once again he's come out and said that essentially he'll leave other Western countries on their own. This is an important point, because Trump treats NATO like a country club, like it's kind of members have to pay up, and if they don't, oh well, then we'll leave you on your own. Well, there's not actually a mandate on that. That's a suggestion. The the percentage of commitment to NATO spending. I do think countries should spend a higher percentage on their defense budget, given the unstable world in which we live. I think there's definitely a case for that. That is a sovereign decision. It's not something that it's not a question of, well, if you don't spend this, you're on your own. I mean, you don't say, to put it this way, I'd make this analogy. Let's say your neighbor lights a candle near a curtain, and that curtain goes on fire. You don't say, oh well, it's their own fault. We're just going to leave them to it while their house is on fire. Um, I draw that analogy because Trump is it's just this flippant disregard for diplomacy. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, actually, Trump's very ignorant about this because Article 5 of NATO, I think the Latin term in its case is forterus, probably pronouncing that wrong, but essentially it means an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, the one time that was invoked was in 2001, after the United States was attacked on September 11th. So the irony of Trump saying, putting out this narrative that it's always America that's protecting everyone, the one time that a NATO member was protected by other NATO members um, in the context of Article 5 was in favor of the United States. So Trump should remember that. I mean, he's illiterate when it comes to history, but that's important. Um, but it goes deeper than that. Trump is a lackey for Vladimir Putin. There's no question about that. Of course, his campaign is denying the claims made by Bob Woodward in his latest book entitled War, which is that Trump personally offered COVID protection to Putin at a time when thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans were dying. And let's not forget, the economy is one of the big issues in this election. Trump's lackluster response to COVID initially, putting out conspiracy theories, refusing to take it seriously for several weeks, um, several vital weeks, if not longer, that not only cost many Americans their lives, it seriously damaged the economy. Trump's handling of COVID was disastrous. So, of course, Biden had to pick up a lot of the pieces. That's an important point. But his attitude to NATO is reprehensible because it's one thing, raising private concerns. That's legitimate for leaders. Allies have disagreements. I think it would be legitimate for Trump if he had, real concerns. Okay, raise those privately in meetings with Germany, France, Britain, and so on. But to say this publicly, to give this to Putin as ammo, Incidentally, the thing about the COVID tests, of course, the Trump campaign denies it, but interestingly enough, Dmitry Peskov has said yes, there was communication between Trump and Putin since Trump left the White House. I've just seen an interesting interview with John Bolton on CNN, former Trump advisor. And of course, he was a senior figure in the Bush administration as well. He's now a big Trump critic. Yes, he does say we need to take these things with a pinch of salt because it's just typical Trumpism. But he points out this is what Trump's doing, and he points out the ridiculousness of Trump attacking NATO in this way. I'll put a link to that interview. Um, I don't think Bolton's in any rush to endorse Kamala Harris, but when you get right wing Republicans like John Bolton, criticizing Trump, that should be a call to wake up and listen. Um, I mean, it's just contemptible because on the day of the invasion of Ukraine, I've made this point many times, but I think it's important. What was Trump's response? That was a genius move by Putin, saying that publicly. Now, Richard Nixon had a lot of dubious comments, but at least he said that privately, or so he thought, on those tapes. Trump says these things publicly. Now, what sort of message does that send out? He probably thought it was a jibe at his domestic rival, Joe Biden. But instead, it was an insult to the Ukrainian people. On the day their country is invaded, he effectively praises the tyrant who does it. It's contemptible, utterly contemptible. I think that Zelensky and the Ukrainian people should be very, very cautious about a Trump win because his version of peace, I think, would be basically pressuring the Ukrainians to surrender a big chunk of their country, if not effectively their whole country, because Putin will not stop at Donbass. He's made that very clear. You just cannot trust an irredentist dictator. Um, but this is like an upside down world because 40 years ago, you know, Republicans were patriotic. The whole thing was about. I mean, Reagan was a populist, but it's ironic. He stood up to the Soviet Union. Um, it's just like everything's turned upside down. You get MAGA Republicans now who are more hostile to the Democrats and to Europe than they are to a Russian dictator. That's just bizarre. Bizarre. Trump said himself Russia's effectively the Soviet Union, yet he's pandering to them. It's just pathetic. What other Trumpisms can we look at? Detroit. He was making a speech in Detroit. He said if Kamala Harris wins, every American city will end up like Detroit. Now, I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit. Um, they've been talking about how Detroiters have reacted with outrage if this. Governor Gretchen Whitmer has condemned, other Michigan residents have. Um, there probably will be some people in Detroit who feel that things could be better. The mayor of Detroit points out we've had a population growth, crime has fallen, we have clean streets. The Trump campaign retaliated by saying, I remember when the auto industry was thriving. So I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit. Democrats shouldn't be too complacent and they shouldn't be too triumphalist about Detroit or other Democrat led cities. I mean, certainly in California, there are severe social problems in Los Angeles and San Francisco, the chronic homeless problem. So I've always said I don't think Democrats should be too smug about that. But there's a basic stupidity here. If you're making a speech in a city, in a battleground state, Michigan is one of the 7 battleground states, why the hell would you insult it? That if you're a Republican strategist, if you're a Trump campaign strategist, that's just stupidity. Don't insult the city that you're in. If I was Donald Trump, I would be praising Detroit. I would be trying to get votes. I mean, he just lacks sense. His mouth gets ahead of him, and this is just stupidity. Even if you argue there's a valid debate around social problems in Michigan and Detroit, um, it's just stupid to insult the very city that you're in. Defies sense. I remember when Bill Clinton visited Birmingham, the G8, that is the British Birmingham, he praised the city. It's diplomacy. That's what you do. You don't insult the city that you're in. You can talk about its problems, but do it in a diplomatic way. Trump and diplomacy don't go hand in hand. What else do we have? The hurricanes. Hurricane response. Whilst Joe Biden and Kamala Harris done the responsible thing as leaders, urged people to evacuate, listen to local officials. I have to say, Ron DeSantis, sounded statesmanlike when he was making a speech as governor. He was telling people all the things that they had to hear. On that incident, the good news is there seems to be less of a death toll from Hurricane Milton than could have been. But certainly Helene was disastrous hurricane, over 200 dead, the deadliest in the continental United States since Katrina 19 years ago. Well, the Democrats were, being leaders. They were telling people to do what they had to do. They were they were speaking to local officials, including Republicans. I'm sure Biden spoke to DeSantis. Um, what does Donald Trump and his lackeys do? They spread disinformation about the Democrats. Marjorie Taylor Greene, absolutely one of the worst politicians in America today, she actually says the Democrats are responsible for this hurricane. I mean, she's a nut. She's an absolute nut. I find it interesting that she was attacking Laura Loomer recently, the far right Trump supporter. It's almost like Satan rebuking sin. Um, that's the sort of people that support Donald Trump. Um, and I hope the good people of Florida look at this and see the different responses between the leaders. I know Trump's visited some sites that were affected by the hurricane, but what sort of leader sends out disinformation in the midst of a disaster? That's just contemptible, absolutely contemptible. What Trump should be doing is reaching out to Democrats and saying, look, I'll work with you to help these people. But that is just beyond Trump. Everything this man does is in his own interest. It's utterly contemptible. So I hope he loses Florida, but we'll see what happens. They talk about the October surprise. Maybe these hurricanes will be that. I don't know. I hope he's lost Michigan after what he said about Detroit, but time will tell. Um, I cannot think in my lifetime of any candidate who is so unqualified for the White House as Donald Trump. I do believe he's the worst president in American history, or at least being generous in the bottom three. Andrew Buchanan, Andrew Johnson were pretty bad. Andrew Johnson shouldn't be forgotten. Rolled back on civil rights that Lincoln had set about. I mean, Johnson was a disastrous president, but Trump certainly the worst in modern times. Not even close. Um, that's for another video. But his position on NATO, I think, is the implications. John Bolton also pointed out this isn't a bluff. If Trump gets back in, some Republicans have said, "Oh, it's just Trump being Trump," but he might go through with this. The American withdrawal from NATO, I think, will have even bigger repercussions than Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. It will be huge geopolitically. It will be early Christmas or whatever national holiday you want to draw out for Putin and Xi Jinping. They will love it. If America withdrew from NATO, that would have severe geopolitical consequences, and it would be treachery to the West on such a scale. I think it would be unforgivable. I think it would be the implications of that. I don't even know, but the partition of NATO, the it would be a Christmas present to Putin. I think it would be, well, let's just hope this man doesn't get back into the White House because it would be, put it this way, if the United States was to suffer another major Islamist attack on the scale of 9/11, then if the United States withdrew from NATO, then the best Western countries could do is offer condolences to America. I think that's the sort of implications. Or you may have some sort of situation of like an American partnership with NATO, like you have with countries like the Philippines and Japan. But the largest, most powerful member state leaving NATO would be catastrophic. Um, and it would be an unforgivable act of treason, in my opinion, towards the West. I suppose people would say the West isn't a sovereign state, hence how can it be treason? But treachery to Western ideals. Um, And it's ironic. Republicans have always hailed Reagan as a sort of god within their party. This is the antithesis of Reaganism. Reagan stood up to the evil empire. Trump panders to it. It's hard to fathom.